Hello friends, this video will be a refutation of one of the most common and most dangerous leftist progressive arguments in the modern day. I've seen very few people touch this subject, so hopefully this video will help fill the gap. What argument, you might ask? Well, if the video title didn't give it away, let's imagine that there are two villages near the Mediterranean Sea in ancient times. A disproportionate amount of boats that go out into the ocean from one of the villages end up sinking, while compared to the other village where their boats almost never sink. So the old wise men get together to try and figure out why this disparate outcome is occurring. In their infinite wisdom, they conclude that clearly the reason is that the people of the first village have not been paying their proper respects to Poseidon. Now, the vast majority of people in these times are probably able to understand why the village elders are wrong. There are hundreds of other reasons for these boats sinking that are all probably a lot more likely than the wrath of Poseidon. However, you may have also heard the following musings. There aren't as many women in the information technology industry as there are men, therefore IT companies are being sexist. There is a disproportionate number of white and Asian kids in gifted education, therefore gifted programs are discriminatory and should be abolished. Or there are statistical racial differences in criminal justice, therefore the entire judicial system is an institutionally racist system. Or America is a systemically racist country because of its history of inequity. As critical race theorist Ibram X. Kendi puts it, a racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. You've probably heard these before. The argument can take hundreds of different forms, but they all boil down to claiming that disparate outcomes between groups is solid evidence of systemic discrimination of the less fortunate group. That if outcomes are not equal, then opportunity must not have been equal. If you have watched breadtubers at all, or read any progressive left theory, there's a good chance you've probably seen something that is along these lines. Thousands of people all over the world and all over the internet seem to be parroting this sort of thinking every day, and that's a problem, because the argument at its core truly is complete and utter trash. This equity fallacy, which I will refer to it as, completely fails on grounds of reason, ethics, and economics. And the almost cult-like belief in this pervasive myth ironically ends up leading to even more discrimination and more divisive identity politics. Let's start first with the logical problems. The first and most common rationale used to try and justify the equity fallacy is a false dichotomy. They will claim that the unequal outcome can only be explained by two factors, genetic factors or environmental factors. They will then try to position it such that any genetic factors must be racist, and believing in them makes you a turbo bigot, and any environmental factors must be discrimination. Therefore, if you do not subscribe to the dogma of equity, you must be a bigot. This is of course a flawed argument, because there are many environmental factors that have nothing to do with discrimination. Hundreds of them in fact, but I'll just name a few of the most obvious. First one would be culture. Different customs have a profound effect on people's values. For instance, some cultures may value wealth more and other cultures may value enlightenment more, while others may value leisure time more. Different cultures also have different ideas of what is even considered successful. So expecting all cultures to achieve the same outcome in all aspects of Western ideas of success is self-contradictory. Next up is religion, probably the biggest external factor of them all. Various research has been done on the heritability of religious ideas from parent to child, with the results on most studies generally settling at 2/3. That's huge. This means the majority of people adopt the religious followings of their parents, and by extension, their ethnic origins. Similar to culture, different religions have drastically different values that will also have a huge impact on people's choices in life, which will obviously lead to different outcomes in life. A footnote on religion that also has to be pointed out is its major impact on gender roles. A study of LDS women showed that higher religiosity in women has a very significant impact on her choices in lifestyle and employment. Similar studies of spirituality have repeated similar findings in other religions. And third is regional demographics. You see, the world we live in, where day-long intercontinental travel is easily accessible, has really only existed for roughly a century. Because of this, people are still largely separated into different areas of the earth on an ethnic and cultural basis, which means the very premise of the argument is flawed because we don't actually even live in the same environment. Just from these three reasons alone, we can already start to see the issue with the equity fallacy. The fallacy works its magic by assuming that taking things from the individual level to the group level, that everything should just magically average out and we should see equal representation. But this simply isn't true. Different contemporary groups hold different values, different goals, different ideas, etc., etc., etc. Therefore, many of the reasons why inequity does not imply discrimination discrimination between groups are largely the same reasons why inequity doesn't imply discrimination between individuals. Most people generally accept the fact that if one student gets an A on a test and another gets a C, the chances are pretty good that the first student simply studied more. Very few would accuse the test itself of somehow being rigged against the second student. These reasons are ultimately tied to people's individual choices. So to claim that all environmental reasons must be discrimination, one is forced to claim that allowing people free choice is somehow bigotry, which is of course ridiculous. However, people who are trying to use the equity fallacy are basically doing just that. They falsely assume that things should average out when we take it from the individual to the group, but when we look at all the various cultural differences, it becomes obvious that this rationale is fatally flawed. The next reasoning mistake is the shifting of the burden of proof. Going back to our story at the start of the two villages and the boats sinking. If you were in the same room with those old men who concluded that the cause of the disparate outcome here is the lack of favor with Poseidon, do you honestly think that you could say anything to those men to convince them that they are wrong? Could you objectively prove that Poseidon does not exist? If you think about it, the reality is no, you really can't. But lack of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's a Russell's teapot paradox, the idea that an undetectable teapot exists somewhere in outer space may be absurd, but you can't actually do anything to prove it's not out there. Similarly, if someone accuses you of being a racist or bigot as the rationale behind your decisions, technically you can't actually prove them wrong. There is currently no way to objectively prove what the thoughts inside your head are to another person, hence why the cult of woke absolutely loves to stoop to this dishonest tactic so much. Accuse your opposition of some unfalsifiable thought crime, and then demand that they somehow prove the accusation wrong. That's not how evidence is supposed to work. The burden of proof is on the person making the positive, provable accusation. Nobody can reasonably be expected to somehow prove that which cannot be verified. Just because discrimination can be difficult to unpack doesn't mean it's reasonable to sling unfalsifiable accusations every which way. This is something that writer and economist Thomas Sowell has largely pointed out as a problem with disparate impact theory, a legal standard that relies on the equity fallacy in order to accuse people of discrimination, and boy have lawyers made a lot of money with this. Often it comes without any real evidence and it's based purely on outcomes. I've talked about outcome bias before on this channel, as it's strangely a common thing among progressive arguments. It's basically when the process that leads to an outcome or desired result is judged based purely on that outcome, without actually attempting to gain a legitimate understanding of how said process works towards the outcome. For instance, a study by the University of Sydney titled "Fooled by Performance Randomness Over Rewarding Luck" looked at how this can affect pundits' judgment of a football player, believing that performance to be a good one even if the evidence showed otherwise. This is pretty much what disparate impact theory does. An accusation of discrimination is made based purely on the unequal outcome, regardless of whether or not any verifiable evidence exists that any discriminatory intent took place. Instead, the accused is expected now to somehow disprove their unverifiable thought crime. Imagine if you were accused of murdering someone you never met in a town you've never been to, and then found yourself before a judge in a court that has no evidence against you. But then because you can't somehow prove that you never met the person or have never been to the place, then you must be guilty. It's completely absurd and breaks the mold of how justice is supposed to work. And thankfully, justice doesn't work this way, except for, of course, in disparate impact. It's an example of bending the rules of logic and reason for the sake of political correctness. 1 + 1 = 3. Because muff wheelings. The last logical issue I will talk about here is God of the gaps. People will often attribute the unknown to supernatural causes. For instance, before electricity was understood, many people used to believe that lightning was an act of God. Or yet again, going back to Poseidon sinking boats, attributing misfortune to a lack of favor with some specific deity, rather than more provable causes. While obviously we aren't seriously talking about theology in this video, a similar argument is often used to justify belief in the equity fallacy, when all of the other reasoning errors I mentioned are accounted for, but a statistical discrepancy between groups cannot be explained by any means. Progressive leftists will often just automatically assume that the unknown variable must be discrimination. They decide to conclude that it's some form of bigotry anyway, despite the lack of evidence for said conclusion. The problem with God of the gaps reasoning is that the appropriate answer to gaps in knowledge is "I don't know." I don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer. Accepting the fact that you do not know something when evidence is inconclusive and withholding judgment until better evidence can be secured is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Filling in gaps of knowledge with one's own belief bias is therefore not honest. So let's now move on to how the equity fallacy relates to economics. The first economic issue that needs to be mentioned here is the one that is tied to a lot of the logical problems I just discussed, which is that many issues that look like an outcome of social inequity actually go away when you control for economic variables, meaning that the problem is more of a class issue most of the time rather than a racial or gender identity issue. One example of this can be found in the criminal justice system. For instance, you have probably heard that African Americans are statistically more likely to die by police shooting, which is technically true. However, what you may not know is that when controlled for economic status, this discrepancy actually goes away. In fact, poverty line whites are actually slightly more likely to be killed by police than poverty line blacks. This doesn't mean that police accountability is not an issue. It absolutely is, as even without the racial gaps, the death by cop rate in America is still ridiculously higher than just about every first world country. So I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm simply pointing out that it's more of an issue of the criminal justice system being generally flawed, not so much racism. This is really just one example among hundreds where identity politics are used to distract people from the truth. But that's a video for another day. The point here is that the equity fallacy often comes packed with a failure to properly control for external variables, with the most common control being socioeconomic status. This is particularly concerning because if you truly wish to solve a problem, you want to control for as many variables as you can possibly think of, so that way you can better narrow down to the actual cause of the problem to fix it, which explains why the cult of woke so often fails to get anything done, LARPing instead as the resistance while agreeing with everything the establishment tells them. Next up, one version of the equity fallacy that you might have heard is that certain groups are earning less money than other groups, therefore the group that is earning more must be doing something wrong. They must be keeping the other group down or taking from them in some way. This is really just a spin on something known as the fixed pie fallacy, which is a common misconception of how economics works in the free market, where people believe that it's always a zero-sum game, or in other words, that one person having lots of pie is the reason another person has less pie. But the reality is financial growth does not work this way. Consider this: does Elon Musk building a bunch of AI electric vehicles mean that somebody else has less AI electric vehicles? Of course not. They didn't even exist before Tesla made them. Wealth tends to grow through the baking of more pies, not by taking from a single pie. So one group having more doesn't necessarily have any relation to another group having less. You see this version of the equity fallacy a lot in wage gap complaints between ethnic and gender groups.
The wage gap is simply the average earnings of men and women working full-time. It does not count for different job positions, hours worked, or different jobs. It has nothing to do with the same job. It has nothing to do with discrimination.
Economists are constantly trying to explain to people that the reasons for these gaps does not automatically imply discrimination, nor does it imply anything nefarious on the group that is earning more in the gap. And the fact that our useless politicized media repeats these false claims doesn't help. It's interesting because nobody complains about the wage gap between Indian Americans and everyone else, almost as if the people making these complaints are simply virtue signaling and don't actually care about the economic data at all. To put it simply, until you trudge through to the statistics, wage gaps don't actually prove much other than, hey, there is a wage gap here. They don't automatically imply anything wrong, and most of the time, the data reveals that it's some form of cultural difference that's at fault, as discussed previously. It also needs to be pointed out how these wage gaps relate to disparate impact theory. Because the gaps exist, technically anything and everything with a price can in theory be accused of being discrimination by disparate impact theory. For instance, if an online store charges, say, $3,000 for a nice high quality laptop, there will be a disparate outcome. No reasonable person, though, would argue that laptops are bigotry, and yet when we applied reductio ad absurdum to how market forces relate to contemporary group purchasing statistics, this is exactly the conclusion that you would be forced to reach with disparate impact theory. Lastly, and this one is especially common in progressives who have studied sociology but have not studied economics, is people seeing racial discrimination in economic problems that actually affect everyone, and have superior solutions that would be better implemented without the identity politics getting in the way. For instance, you may have heard the following argument: hey, people born rich are more likely to stay rich, people born poor are more likely to stay poor, therefore due to generational wealth transfer and laws like Jim Crow in the past, must systemic racism. The problem with this reasoning is that the racial identity politics are not necessary because you could just figure out ways to help the poor. It's pretty easy to determine a person's socioeconomic status without looking at what other millions of potential other identity groups they belong to, or trying to equate along the lines of past grievances. So you could just determine that and base your decisions on that alone. The intersectionality becomes quite of a red herring, really. Colorblind solutions to better economic upward mobility wouldn't just come with the benefit of less divisive identity politics. They are also in the long term significantly more sustainable, because it forces you to look at specifically why the problem exists for everyone. And this may lead you to noticing, for instance, the tons of unnecessary startup fees, to creating a business that only exists because large corporations lobbied for them in order to prevent competition, to which Congress happily obliged due to them being corrupt bloodsuckers that they are. Perhaps we should start with that before we go to arguing who is standing in the bigger shit pile of our wonderful identity politics. Removing these barriers would be far more effective in the long term. It's an example of giving a man a fish to feed him for a day versus teaching a man to fish and feeding him for life. Often the far left wants to remedy past injustices with ideas like reparations without considering the reality that before even getting into the ethics of reparations, you run into the more ruthless question of why is a short-term solution being proposed to such a complex problem? Giving a certain group of people a one-time boost in money, say $20,000 or whatever, would do absolutely nothing to fix the government corruption that causes the issue of economic mobility being so difficult in the first place. Or even worse, sometimes the entire argument is just a ruse to slide in Marxism and claim that because the free market can result in inequity, then we should instead try doomed socialist experiment number 862B. But enough about that. Lastly, the ethical problems. The first major issue of ethics actually goes back to one of the logical issues, outcome bias. You see, the biggest flaw with using outcome bias to justify believing an unequal outcome must mean discrimination is actually when it really is discrimination. If you don't understand how the process is causing the discrimination, how do you know you are actually blaming the correct person or system for the discrimination? The fact is you don't, and this actually might be the biggest problem with the equity fallacy. For instance, say a small town has a large IT company, and statistics show a very significant racial disparity in this company's hiring practices. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that in this case the cause of this disparity is discriminatory. Now, without looking at the process that is causing the disparity, is the fault with the HR department of this company or the upper management? Trick question. In this hypothetical scenario, it's neither. It's actually the fact that the town is divided into two school districts with significantly more minorities being required to attend the inferior institution due to where they live, leading of course to significantly less academically qualified individuals when they reach adulthood. The point here is that without looking at the process and investigating what's really going on in this town, you would have no way of knowing that. This is why outcome bias is such a dangerous reasoning mistake. Not only does outcome bias result in false accusations of discrimination where there are none, but in cases where disparities actually are the result of discrimination, outcome bias can lead people down the path of accusing the wrong party, thus allowing the discrimination to continue while the innocent are punished. This is why false accusations of a problem tend to make the problem worse. It creates a layer of bullshit that the courts have to comb through in order to get to the truth. Even children can understand that in the story of the boy who cried wolf, the wolf in the end is the winner. And yet, for some reason, grown adults have yet to figure out that the same is true for crying discrimination. Next issue is that equity for the group often results in destruction of equal opportunity for the individual. Say there is a prestigious university with two candidates, Bob and Steve. Steve is less qualified, but gets accepted over Bob anyways because the dean likes blue more than red. 50 years later, there is now a new dean who wants to remedy past injustice. Two candidates again, Carl and Richard, with Carl being less qualified. This time, Carl gets accepted because equity. Or how about a teacher that decides to equate every student's test score to a C regardless of how well each individual student did? These thought experiments prove a simple point. While equity is achieved at the group level, inequality of opportunity is created at the individual level. People who believe in the equity fallacy tend to believe in it because they think true equal opportunity should result in equity. But in practice, what we actually see is exactly the opposite. People are torn down to create the illusion of equity between group identity, which is silly because when you think about it, group identity, if we are really being serious about it, can be further fractured down. Why stop at equity between color groups? Why not also equate for religion? How about gender, or third additional gender identities? Attractiveness, economic status? And not all families are equally nepotistic, by the way. Or how about whether or not they were abused? Physical disabilities? Or how about personality type? Introverts tend to experience a very different life after all. Mental disabilities? That goes there too. Each and every one of them?
You're going to just stop with economic inequality, are you? It's a complete bloody catastrophe. It's an absolute mess. And intersectionality, the discovery of intersectionality on the left is actually the radical left's discovery of the fundamental flaw in their identity politics ideology. Groups can be multiplied without limit. Okay, that's not a problem. That's a fatal flaw. And they've already discovered it. They just haven't figured it out. The reason that the West privileges the individual is because we figured out 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, that you can fractionate group identity appropriately right down to the level of the individual.
I don't agree with everything Jordan Peterson says, but in this case he has hit the nail on the head. The individual is obviously always a better measure of the individual than the group. Even with a bag of identical looking green marbles, at the molecular level, you will notice differences. Judging the individual for the alleged crimes of the group is simply wrong. Next up, the equity fallacy forces the judicial branch to be racist. Title VI requires judges to be race neutral. In a recent expansion of Port Freeport in Texas, disparate impact was brought up to try and block the expansion due to the area being predominantly Hispanic. The argument was made that the expansion was somehow being racist because of this, which is ridiculous because it's a ship-port expansion. It has only one place it can possibly go. A fantastic example of the third problem I mentioned with the equity fallacy being a false dichotomy, regional demographics. But because disparate impact creates such an absurdly low standard for what can be considered discrimination, this puts judges in a very tough position because it makes them put a racial thumb on the scales of justice. Problem is, that's a direct violation of Title VI, placing progressives in a funny position where if they want disparate impact to be a thing in these situations, they would actually have to repeal or at least significantly revise the Civil Rights Act. It's racism being disguised as anti-racism, or as Circuit Court Judge James Ho says, the courts must be blind to race, but disparate impact theory requires the opposite. And now for the final ethical issue, which is that the equity fallacy opens Pandora's box. Here's a question. When you talk about the disparities groups face on average, is it unreasonable for people to discuss attributes of that group as an average? Well, no, since if you want to understand the true reasons for a problem, then it must be investigated from every angle. This creates a massive issue because it leads people to talking about group averages that many may find uncomfortable. Often with discussion on things like the average crime rates and average IQ and why those differences exist, easily bleeding into what many would consider racist rhetoric. I have seen plenty of data from both sides of this subject and argument, such as whether it's environmental or possibly traceable to early childhood or can be traced to haplogroups. A lot of it is inconclusive and people can argue over it endlessly. The problem though is that some of this data ends up being unfortunately used to justify actual racial hatred. And then of course, progressives get massively butthurt over this, which is extremely hypocritical on their part since it's usually them bringing up the topic of group averages in the first place, as that's exactly what the equity fallacy is. They miss the bigger point, which is that this kind of discussion shouldn't even be happening because all of this can be again fractured down to the individual. The individual is the smallest minority. What their subjective group average is, depending on whatever group they are being fractured into, should largely be seen as irrelevant. The content of their individual character and their individual personal experience in life and their abilities are all what should matter. Wow, you can more accurately determine the traits of an individual apple by looking at that apple instead of the basket of apples it came from? Wow, what a novel concept. You can clearly see the results of this today. Racial relations have taken a noticeable nosedive, all largely starting with the great SJW cringe fest of early 2010s, where we saw the peak of Marxists replacing class warfare with identity politics and racial warfare. It has been an absolute and colossal failure, and progressives pretending like they have no blame in this are being massively irresponsible. In conclusion, the equity fallacy is a severely flawed argument for a variety of reasons. But if you are stretched for time and need a quick way to refute it, the underlying fault that people using this argument are almost always guilty of is a failure to control for any other possible variables. For instance, the three I mentioned earlier, regional demographics, culture, and religion, should be a bare minimum standard. Yet, if you do a quick Google search for X is racist or sexist, and you can substitute X for just about anything, you will be treated to a multitude of utterly ridiculous articles written by hacks looking to pat themselves on the back by appearing woke. Read these articles looking for what they controlled for, and often they've only controlled for usually nothing, or maybe one variable, two if you're very lucky. So the results can effectively be summarized as asserting that their own lack of honest research means that the reason for the discrepancy should automatically, magically default to discrimination, which is of course completely both absurd and extremely concerning since their failure to properly understand these processes means that even if in situations where the cause actually is discriminatory, they have no idea if they are even blaming the discrimination on the correct source. So When you encounter this equity fallacy in the wild, simply ask what other variables were looked at, and most of the time you will be met with blank, confused stares, followed by an inability to provide a reasonable answer. I live near a very liberal city, so trust me, I know. Final note is a disclaimer. The purpose of this video is not to deny that racism and discrimination exists. They obviously do and are a problem. The point is that false accusations of discrimination are inherently harmful to honest discourse. The cult of woke has grown so addicted to the dopamine crack rush they get by feeling superior to someone when accusing them of bigotry that they no longer care if those accusations are valid or even make sense. If the left and right want to have any hope of agreeing on anything, then the bullshit argument that is the equity fallacy must come to an end. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, and all that. Also, I'll be mirroring content on Odyssey when I get around to it, so if you prefer the LBRY blockchain, I should have content there within the next week or so.